And our main story this morning is that the government is planning to introduce mandatory life sentences for anyone who kills emergency worker while committing an offence.
It will be named Harper's Law in memory of PC Andrew Harper, who was dragged to his death by a getaway car driven by a gang of teenage burglars in Berkshire.
We can speak now, live on Breakfast, to the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab. Thanks so much for joining us. I remember sitting in court and covering part of the case on the Andrew Harper trial. How influential has his widow, Lissy, been in getting this change in the law?
Well, you're right, it's a harrowing case, as you will have seen firsthand. And I think Lissy's done an amazing job with the local police federation in making the case for this change. We do believe that in a case like that, where an emergency worker responding, in that case, to a suspected crime, apprehending those involved and being killed in the line of their duty, we do think that that should attract a mandatory life sentence. And it's not just the individual case, and I pay tribute to Lizzie, but it's also the fact that in the last year, 10,000 convictions for assaults on emergency workers have taken place. So it's not just individual cases, it's the scale of it. And we think as we come through this pandemic and we build back stronger, fairer in all sorts of ways, we should increase the sentences for those attacks and murders or unlawful killings, I should say, of emergency workers. And we want them to know that we've got their back.
In the case of PC Harper, 3 teenagers were jailed, weren't they, for between, I think, 13 and 16 years. Will this law change affect their sentence, or does their sentences, they just remain unchanged?
Well, you'll remember that my predecessor, Rob Buckland, had sought to appeal, if you like, the sentence with the mechanism that's available for that. That wasn't accepted. And that's one of the things that made us look very carefully and focus on changing the law. But of course, it only applies to crimes and sentences going forward. So it's prospective, not retrospective. I think that's the right thing to do. But that's a change that Lissy wanted. It's a change that I agree needs to take place. And I think it will give confidence, and I hope it will give confidence to emergency workers across the country that we're on their side. And I think for the public, that's the kind of change that they'd like to see.
Oh, certainly, it's a change which seems to have public backing. But Lissy Harper was calling for this over 2 years ago. Why has it taken so long to get to this stage?
Well, I've only been in this role for a few months, but I know that a lot of care and attention and work have gone into it. And of course, you need a legislative vehicle. We'll do it through the Police Sentencing Crime Courts Bill at the right time. So we're now in a position to do this, and we're announcing it precisely because we've got a legislative vehicle. We'll introduce this to Parliament shortly, and we can get it done swiftly.
Can I ask you as well about Colin Pitchfork, the double child killer? He was released from prison a couple of months ago, but he's been picked up again by the authorities. He's now back behind bars, exactly what the families of his victims had warned about would happen. What do you say to them this morning when they say that the system is not working? It needs a massive overhaul.
So I think there's two things. Firstly, on this case, my heart goes out to the family in this, again, another harrowing, tragic case. There'll be a very rigorous process for consideration of his case going forward, and forgive me if I don't comment on it because I don't want to prejudice it, not least because of the very serious concerns there are. More broadly, we are doing a root and branch review into the parole system, and I would just say this: I think one of the problems in cases like this is that there is if you like, a presumption that unless it can be demonstrated that the individual presents a risk, that they will be released. And I want to look at that again because I think actually that presumption is the wrong way. If you take, for example, climate change and environmental law, we have what's called a precautionary principle because of the risk involved. And I think in cases like this, where there's a serious question about risk to the public and public protection, I think we should have a more precautionary approach. But let me work through all of those proposals more generally, and we will come forward with them when we've got them into the right shape.
But the families of Pitchfork's victims, they said there was a risk. Whatever paperwork is done, they looked at the facts and said, hang on, there is a risk here. He shouldn't be released. You mentioned Robert Buckland, your predecessor as Justice Secretary. He says Pitchfork should never have been released and that the whole system needs to be reformed as a matter of urgency. How do you reassure him? How do you reassure the public that that is actually happening urgently?
Well, I do want to reassure the public, and I've explained that I'm looking at this very carefully. I've only been Justice Secretary for a few months. Rob Buckland was Justice Secretary before, so he can account for the system up until that point. But look, this kind of case, I think, is very frustrating for the public. And the assurance I can provide is I will look at this very closely. And as we've done with Harper's Law and other areas which we're going to be talking about in the days and weeks ahead, we will come back with the right balance to make sure that public protection is not just the top priority, but it is the overriding priority. And that in the question of presumptions that are built into this system, and I can only operate currently to the system that's in place, but the presumptions, I feel, do not strike the right balance. I think the presumption must be in favour of public protection for those most serious of cases. So it gives you a sense of the direction of travel, but let me come up with the proposals in the right way and present them in the round.
As well as Justice Secretary, of course, you're Deputy Prime Minister. This is the first time we've spoken to one of the Cabinet since that rather bizarre speech by the Prime Minister a couple of days ago. All those long silences and references to Peppa Pig. What did you make of it when you saw it?
Prime Minister's on great form. Look, the reality is this is, people talk about speeches and the Westminster village, the gossip and all the rest of it. In this country, we're coming out of the pandemic. If we'd have listened to the Labour Party, we would stuck in lockdown. As a result of the decisions the Prime Minister has taken, growth is up, economic growth, jobs are up, wages are up. We're focused on the reform agenda. I've given you two examples in my area, criminal justice, but I'm looking at victims reform, human rights reform. We've got sentencing reform going through the House of Parliament right now. The Transport Secretary has announced a whole range.
Yeah, we know that, and we've covered all those things in great depth. But you know that as well as the smiles about Peppa Pig, there are serious concerns at the highest level within Downing Street about whether the Prime Minister has a grip on it. This wasn't just one speech, was it? That speech highlighted what for many is a much bigger issue about the way he does this job.
No, I don't agree, and it's the job of Westminster commentators to pick up on one anonymous source from wherever they found it to say that to criticise the government of the day. That's fine. In relation to Peppa Pig, it is a fantastic British export around the world, and I think that was the point the Prime Minister was making. But the reason I gave all of those examples is, frankly, this government and this Prime Minister are focused on the job at hand, building back better after the pandemic, the economic growth and the jobs that the Chancellor is focused on, the transport, the infrastructure in the north that the Transport Secretary is focused on, and the criminal justice reforms that the Home Secretary and I are focused on. I think that's what voters ultimately, and your viewers, expect us to be focused on.
If Keir Starmer had made a speech like that, if Nicola Sturgeon had made a speech like that, or Joe Biden, or Angela Merkel, you would not be just brushing this aside, would you? And saying, oh, it was just a speech. You know, if your political opponents had done that, you'd be making hay and you'd say this person is not fit to do politics.
I ignore Keir Starmer every day of the week because they don't have anything serious to say about credible alternatives to the agenda, economic, transport, criminal justice that we've set out. And I'm happy to do so now.
How serious did Boris Johnson look on Monday?
Look, I think the Prime Minister is an ebullient, bouncy, optimistic, Tiggerish character, and he livens up his speeches in a way that few politicians, past and present, have done. But actually, there is a steeliness to him as a Prime Minister, and indeed his team, and we work as a team. And I've given you all the things that we're focused on. I'm happy to support the glowing references to Peppa Pig. I remember watching it with my two nippers, but the reality of this government is focused on the pandemic, the vaccine rollout, the boosters, the dealing with the NHS backlog, the levelling up agenda so that we've got the infrastructure in the north, the criminal justice agenda, giving assurance to the victims of crime and making sure we've got robust sentences in place. And frankly, what you're asking me about, and I'm really happy to be asked about it, and I understand why the Westminster Commentary does that, but it's fairly peripheral to what I and the rest of the Cabinet and the Prime Minister
But
spend our time
the
doing.
whole country has been transfixed by that speech the other day. It's all over social media, and a lot of people are talking about.
Honestly, can I just pick you up on that?
I think Stella Creasy. I'm really sorry. Just one last question.
I think the country has been transfixed by the Westminster tittle-tattle around that.
Okay.
What they do care about is jobs, the NHS, transport, criminal justice.
Stella Creasy, Labour MP, has said that she's received an email from the Commons authorities telling her that she can't take her 3-month-old baby into the Commons. 3 months, probably a bit too young for Peppa Pig. What do you think? Is that the right call? Should she be allowed to take her baby into the Commons?
Well, this is for the House authorities to decide. But what I would say is, we, even with colleagues on the other side of different political parties, have watched, and I say this as a father of young kids myself, watched the mums and indeed the dads with young children around the House of Commons. It has got a lot better at allowing the kind of flexibility that working mums and working dads need, and I think that's really important. Quite what the right balance is in terms of the chamber, let me leave that to the House authorities. But frankly, I've got a lot of sympathy for Stella Creasy on all of these things, because I've seen her with her young child. I've seen many other MPs on all sides of the House balancing this, and it's difficult, as it is for parents, young parents, mums and dads across the country. So I think we do need to make sure that our profession is brought into the modern world, the 21st century, and can allow parents to juggle the jobs they do with the family time that they need.
So if you're at the dispatch box giving a big speech to the Commons and you look across and you see Stella Creasy with her baby around her neck, and maybe Boris Johnson's got Wilfred on his knee next to him, you never know, next to you, how do you on a personal level see that? Does that affect you? Do you think that should happen?
I'm just a sucker for young kids, and I always think it's, when you see your colleagues with their children, given the rough and tumble of politics, I just always think it brings out the best in people. Whether it's the right thing in the chamber, there'll be different views on that. It's for the authorities, the House authorities, to decide, but it certainly wouldn't distract me or get in the way of me doing my job.
Dominic Raab, thank you very much indeed.